The Shroud of Turin lies still, guarded and quiet, just as it has for centuries. People line up to see it, leaning in to stare at the faint image of a man. They do the one thing nobody can stop them from doing. They reach out and touch. There is a penalty for not knowing what comes next in this story. You might keep thinking that mystery DNA on the cloth means it must be ancient and true, a frozen moment from the 1st century. The reward for staying with me is seeing why the DNA on the shroud tells a thrilling travel story without necessarily telling the one story many people want most. Because the shroud has a problem no other relic has. It has been handled for centuries, exposed to crowds, and has collected people the way fabric collects dust. In 2015, when scientists looked at genetic traces in that dust, the shroud did not whisper one origin. It shouted a crowd. Before the shroud became famous, it was already vulnerable. It is made of linen, and linen does not lock the world out. It takes the world in. Every time it is moved, shown, or touched, it becomes less like a sealed time capsule and more like a shared object in a living room full of guests. People did not treat it like a lab sample. They treated it like a holy thing. That means hands, breath, fibers, sweat, skin cells, and dust. This small stuff feels like nothing in the moment, but it builds up until the object carries a hidden crowd inside it. If you picture the shroud as a person, its childhood is chaos. It lives through exposure. Its struggle is simple. It cannot move through history without history leaving fingerprints on it. That matters because the shroud later becomes a magnet for hope, doubt, and fame. It is the kind of object people argue about for 100 years. Then science enters the room and asks a question that sounds clean, but isn't. What DNA is on this cloth? In 2015, a peer-reviewed analysis in Scientific Reports examined dust vacuumed from the shroud. The team looked at human mitochondrial DNA, the markers passed through the mother's line. They found signatures from Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and East Africa. Then they found a detail that makes people sit up straight. Rare Indian lineages, listed as M39, M56, R7, and R8, which are common in eastern India. That single line about India is the spark. The moment people hear India and Shroud of Turin, the imagination lights up with secret origins and ancient roots. But the shroud does not play fair with clean stories. It has been handled and exposed. The study's own framing points to the fact that this genetic mix can reflect centuries of contact and contamination by many people, not a single ancient source. That is the first trap. People think DNA is a fingerprint that points to one person, one place, and one time. That is sometimes true in a controlled setting, but the shroud is not controlled. Its ancestors are not grandparents in a family tree. They are the hands, the places, and the travel it went through. The shroud's first big problem is fame. The more famous it becomes, the more people want to touch it. For centuries, every close contact became a tiny transfer of dust, cells, or hair. Then, there is the problem of travel. The shroud did not live one quiet life in one sealed box. It moved across trade routes with contact that can include Europe, Africa, and Asia. The consequence is that the world becomes part of it. That is why the 2015 study reads like an airport arrivals board. Even the plant DNA adds to the drama, showing species from the Mediterranean, Asia, the Middle East, and even the Americas. This does not mean the cloth was born in all those places. It means it came into contact with people and materials connected to many places, like a coat worn through a crowded station. Researchers give two main explanations for why Indian lineages show up. The first is about the linen itself. The weave style, called Sindan, might trace to ancient Indian textiles. The second explanation is simpler. Later handlers of Indian descent could have contaminated the cloth during its documented path from the Near East to Europe after 1353 AD. India shows up because people touched it later, and the shroud kept the trace. Here's the hard part. DNA breaks down over time. Older fragments degrade, while more recent touch is easier to detect. DNA degradation favors recent sources because older fragments break down faster. If you hope the DNA is a clean signal from the 1st century, degradation makes that harder. The shroud's ancestor story is a series of mini-dramas about exposure. Every new contact adds new traces. The consequence is that the relic becomes a record of devotion, not just origin. The dust becomes global. When researchers vacuum dust from the shroud, they are not sampling a fresh surface, they are sampling centuries of buildup. You can read the DNA as a travel log or treat it like a birth certificate. This must be placed against the most famous date tied to the shroud. This DNA diversity challenges but does not overturn the 1988 carbon dating, which gave a range of 1260 to 1390 AD. The DNA does not erase that. What it does is explain how a relic could collect traces from many groups without meaning it is ancient. A crowded sample does not mean older, it can mean handled. Think of it like cumulative environmental exposure in a lab sample. A sample can look exotic because it has been exposed to many sources. It doesn't mean the sample began in all those places. It means the sample has been in the world. This is where the shroud mirrors the human habit around famous things. When a story is precious, people touch it and add their own meaning. The more people touch the story, the more the story changes. The cloth becomes less like a sealed message and more like a guest book with thousands of signatures. People want one answer, but the DNA suggests something messier. A traveler that collected whispers and fingerprints. The India detail is a perfect example of how a small fact can get hijacked. A rare lineage like M39 sounds like a secret code, but it could simply mean a rare person touched it. Recent evidence draws a boundary. No 2026 retests validate sensational hidden code narratives. The payoff is that the shroud's DNA reads like a travel diary written in dust. It shows contact with people from Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and East Africa. It shows plant traces linked to the Mediterranean and the Americas. That is not a clean stamp of authentic or fake. It is a portrait of exposure. The more people lean in, the more the cloth becomes a mirror of them. The DNA does not hand you a single origin, it hands you a crowd. You are seeing centuries of journeys pressed into linen. The man involved was already famous when the blood became his. You can picture him wounded and handled, but you can also picture strangers in white coats trying to read a body from a stain. They hear AB blood and think they have a secret key. The real twist is that while the cloth may hold blood, the blood typing may not hold a clear answer. The shroud is not a fresh crime scene. It is an object handled and fought over for centuries. When people say AB, they are not holding a perfect lab sample. Early tests reported AB blood, but those methods can fail on ancient material. Critics say the typing is not solid because of degradation and contamination. In the 1980s, researchers like Heller and Adler reported A and B antigens alongside markers like porphyrins. Their picture was, this looks like real blood, not paint. However, even if you accept there is real blood, old serology can trip. Forward typing can give false positives because bacteria can make sugars that look like blood antigens. When you add contamination from handlers, the noise rises. AB is reported but not clean. People chase AB to match a Semitic picture of Jesus. But the rarity myth is a trap. Global AB averages 3% to 5%. It reaches 10% in parts of Japan and 7% among Arabs. It is not a one-region stamp. Genotyping is not possible here because the DNA is fragmented. This stays in the world of forensic intrigue. The AB claim spreads because it feels like insider knowledge, but the shroud remains a place where belief and evidence wrestle. It carries traces, but those traces are hard to lock down. The cloth has been touched too much, the sample is too old, and the numbers are too normal. The story is that AB became a symbol. The shroud does what it has always done. It pulls people towards certainty, but the evidence refuses to cooperate. In 2015, one abundant mitochondrial pattern found in the dust matched a type typical of the Druze community. The Druze are a closed group in the Near East. If you don't stay with this, you keep thinking the story is only about medieval Europe. By the 14th century, the shroud was in France, and later Italy. Western Europe is not where the Druze haplotype is common. Every stop on that route added more hands and breadth. The University of Padua study identified haplotype H33, described as typical of the Druze. The Druze chose to remain a closed community, so their DNA patterns stay recognizable. The shroud became an object where distinct traces can show up if the right person gets close. Many pilgrims chose closeness, resulting in transfer. A high-touch artifact becomes a collector of human traces. Clergy handled it for display, and restorers worked with care, potentially leaving modern traces behind. PCR copying also favors less degraded recent traces, meaning the DNA story might lean toward the people who touched it recently. H33 being abundant suggests Middle Eastern contact rather than just local Europeans. It does not mean the cloth belonged to a Druze person in the 1st century. Their faith emerged around the 11th century AD. It suggests the shroud's life was touched by people whose roots were not Western European. The DNA finding can align with the 1988 radiocarbon date while still challenging a purely Western forgery story. The shroud is a traveler with a long, messy social life. In the 1970s, Max Fry used sticky tape to lift away a hidden map of more than 50 pollen types. About 45 were linked to the Near East. This mix suggests a path from the Middle East toward Constantinople, then to medieval Europe. Names like Gundelia tourneforti, a thorny Jerusalem thistle, and Zygophyllum domosum from the Negev appear. The pollen was concentrated on the front side, suggesting outdoor exposure. High density of Gundelia is tied to pre-8th century Jerusalem, making a medieval-only story harder to keep. A 2016 study reread some plant traces as helichrysum, tied to burial balms used in 1st century Jewish rituals. The pollen gradient is a travelogue. Near Eastern majority, Byzantine traces, and minimal European signals. If the cloth had spent most of its life in Italy, you would expect local pollen to dominate. Instead, Near Eastern types dominate the list. It is a trail of exposures that builds a story of movement. Finally, plant DNA pointing to the Americas indicates post-medieval handling, as those species were unknown in Europe before 1492. This means the shroud's dust carries signals from the 16th century through the 20th century. In 2015, the University of Padua study got 93 fragments from at least dozens of people. The matches included European, Middle Eastern, North African, and Indian signals. The edge areas showed diversity from later centuries, while body areas hinted at earlier paths. No single genome dominates, ruling out isolated use. It looks like many people handled it over time, fitting the history of veneration and displays. The shroud is famous because people want it to be one thing: a clean birth certificate. Yet the dust particles point to a long guest list. It is a fabric that gathered the quiet DNA echoes of people from far apart places. The shroud does not settle the debate. It shows the crowd. It is a stage that history never stopped walking across.